Welcome to this instructional video of Healight, intended for patients positive for COVID-19 who are mechanically ventilated. In this video, we will go through the device components, we'll walk through the assembly of the device, we will go through the pre-procedural setup, as well as the treatment itself, and then finally removing the Healight catheter. Shown here is the device controller with the start button, the stop button, a power switch generally set to high power, as well as a clear button. Connectors for air and for electrical. Behind the controller, we have the desiccant. Beneath that is the water bottle, and then the air compressor with its on and off switch. The UV light catheter, when not in use, should be stored with a foam protector which is easily placed and removed for when the catheter needs to be in use. Here's the UV light catheter itself. Start at the proximal end at the tip. We can see that that tip is sealed. Inside the most distal 10 centimeters of the UV light catheter are the lights themselves, as well as markings for how deep the catheter is inserted. And then at the distal end, we have the air connectors, as well as the electrical connector, which get connected to the umbilical. Here's the three-way multi-port connector, which can be connected to the ventilator, as well as a respiratory catheter, and then the UV light catheter, each of which has its own port, and a swivel mechanism that can be used to engage either the respiratory catheter or the UV light catheter as needed. Shown here is connection of the respiratory catheter as well as the UV light catheter to two of those ports. And then the swivel mechanism, which can be easily engaged by pushing the green button and then carefully swiveling the swivel in order to engage the proper catheter. Shown here are the plastic clamps, which should be sized appropriately to the size of the endotracheal tube that the patient is intubated with. Here is a bite block, and the bite block is used to protect the patient from biting down on the ET tube and the catheter while it is engaged. In order to secure the bite block, it's possible that the edge may need to be cut for proper positioning. Be sure to have handy a container for obtaining samples, and this should be available at the bedside prior to each treatment as well as after final treatment. Here's the umbilical shown in blue. At each end of the umbilical are two air ports as well as one electrical port, and these get connected to the device as well as to the controller. For the assembly of the device itself, it's important to have the proper equipment in place before the device needs to be deployed. This means at the time of intubation, ideally one would place the multi-port access catheter hooked up to the endotracheal tube and the ventilator to be prepared for eventually being able to use the light device. It would also be helpful to have the bite block inserted and positioned properly with the endotracheal tube so that the device can go through without risk of damage of the device should the patient bite down during the procedure. For proper positioning of the bite block, it may be necessary to actually cut it and allow for the endotracheal tube to be properly positioned. At this point, the third port is available until it's needed for use of the device for when it is able to be hooked up. In the meantime, this third port is covered with a sealed cap, and this cap should not be removed until it is time to be used. Note that when it comes time to use the device for a treatment, the first thing that happens is that the UV light catheter is connected to that third port, first by removing the cap, and then connecting the UV light catheter to the third port. If this were a treatment, the device would actually be inserted into the endotracheal tube, and that occurs before the umbilical is connected to the device controller, as shown here. Prior to the procedure, check the volume settings and make sure that the patient is on volume control ventilation as well as 100% FiO2, which should be for at least 30 minutes prior to the procedure. If the patient is breathing on their own or they are not sedated or paralyzed, other control settings may be considered. Prior to each treatment, a sample should be obtained from the respiratory tract. Shown here is use of the respiratory suction catheter to obtain a pre-treatment sample. Note that the amount of saline that is required to be instilled in order to obtain the sample should be documented. In order to ensure the safety of the patient, as well as the safety of the healthcare workers in the room, ideally we do not want to break the circuit of the COVID intubated patient. In addition, it is important to have in mind the proper sequencing of the device procedures in order for everything to go smoothly and allow the device to work as intended. We use the mnemonic ICU treat. I for insert. First, the UV light catheter is inserted into the endotracheal tube of the patient. Then C for clamp. The clamp is placed in order to maintain the insertion of the catheter into the endotracheal tube and that it not be moved or dislodged during the treatment part of the procedure. Then U for umbilical, and at this point, after insertion of the device and clamping of the device, only then is the umbilical connected to the UV light catheter in order to begin the treatment process. At this point, after the device has been inserted, clamped, and the umbilical connected, the treatment can occur by diverting attention at this point to the controller, which is now able to be turned on and warmed up for the procedure. Now we will go through the UV light treatment itself. What you can see here is the setup where the device is already attached to the multiport catheter, and before using it, the foam protector is removed. In order to engage the device, now we have already sampled with the suction catheter, so we no longer need the suction catheter. The device is swiveled in order to engage the UV light catheter. The catheter is inserted all the way until the tip is sitting at the tip of the ET tube. There are two ways to determine that this is happening. Number one is to look and see if the numbers align with the numbering of the ET tube. And the second is to use the clamp that is provided in order to make sure that the device sits properly. Note that the clamp needs to be attached to the plastic piece at the distal end of the catheter in order to ensure that the device stays in place throughout the duration of the 20 minutes of light delivery. Once the device is into the patient, only then is the umbilical connected to the light catheter device. The air compressor could be turned on, followed by the controller, and then we wait. It takes approximately 2 minutes for the machine to warm up, and the information that's shown on the screen is that the system is initializing. Please select the high-powered mode and then press start. After approximately 2 minutes, the machine will then enter an additional 30-second warm-up prior to being able to deliver the beginning of the treatment. Once the treatment begins, the display will show treatment in progress, and then a countdown timer from 20 minutes will begin. After the 20 minutes of light treatment, the controller will automatically turn off the lights, and then a 30-second cool-down period will begin with the display showing cooling in progress. If this is the final day of treatment, then at this point the UV light catheter can be disengaged from the multi-access port, and the port that the device was connected to should be capped with the appropriate cap in order to close off that port for further use. Once the treatment has been completed, the first thing to do is to remove the umbilical from the device connection. At that point, the clamp should first be removed, and then the device should be withdrawn from the endotracheal tube. Once the device is completely withdrawn, it can be swiveled back to position the respiratory catheter to be engaged for the duration of the next 24 hours until the device needs to be used again. In the meantime, while the UV light catheter is not in use, place it in the protective foam sheath in order to make sure that the device is not dislodged or otherwise damaged in between procedures. If this is the final day of treatment, then at this point, the UV light catheter can be disengaged from the multi-access port. Once the device has been removed from the multi-access port, the tip of the device should be cut off and placed in a separate sample container for subsequent evaluation.